Welcome back to my continuing mission to remake and animate all of my desktop icons in 3D software. I started this one off with Safari because, after all, what's a computer if you can't use it to browse the internet? I'm curious, out of all the major browsers, which one do you guys prefer? Personally, I use Chrome, although I may make the switch to Firefox soon, who knows. But I picked Safari because I thought it would be an interesting icon to animate. I started off by making the same rounded sort of app background thing that I've made in a bunch of the other videos, and I used inset and the circle thing from Loop Tools to make a circle and extrude it inward to get the compass face. Then I just used simple beveling to add a little bit of interesting detail to these edges. To make the markers, I just added a circle, extruded it inward, beveled the inner edges, and removed the sections that were unbeveled. Pro tip, you can do separate by selection and then just delete the other object. Then I just duplicated it, rotated it a few degrees, and selected the inner vertices so that I could extrude it locked outward to make these little short ones. And then I just joined the two to make it a single object. With it joined, I extruded it and added a bevel modifier to it just to, again, have those little subtle edges. That's something that's a really great trick for realism, especially if you're not super constrained by topology count. Having a little bit of bevel allows whatever your surface is to catch the light in a way that's much more dynamic and much more realistic. I've said this before, but if you look at basically any object, there is nothing that is perfectly sharp outside of, things that are machined to be that way. And to make the compass dial, I just added a plane, deleted half of it, added a mirror modifier, so I only have to make half of it at once, extruded it outward, and just scaled that edge down until it lined up perfectly with one of my little ticks on the compass. Extruded the whole thing to add some solidity to it, and then I just grabbed these edges and modified it to sort of be roughly the shape that I think it would be in looking at other compass references. I also added a little shaft to it just because even though it's not going to be visible from the front orthographic view that we're going to be rendering from, the shadow created by it might be visible, and I always like to control for things that I'm not totally sure about because realistic shadowing is one of those things that really sells a render. I also put in a few support loops just to support especially the center edge because I wanted to have a little bit of a ridge. I tried pulling it out and giving it a little bit of a lip, but I didn't really like that, so I put it back. And then for the same reasons as before, I added a bevel modifier just to give it that little extra subtle realism. And then it was time to move on to materials. So I selected everything but that interface in preparation to add a separate material to it to make the face. I created two material slots, one for the body of the compass and one for the interface. And then I just selected the inverse of what I had selected previously to get that interface and assign the material to it. And I have the material just temporarily turned red so that I can tell what the material is assigned to. I went on to add the same material to the compass needle and then make it single user just by clicking the little icon that indicates how many users a material has. That's a nice trick. When you create a single user copy, it maintains all of the information about the material, but it makes it a single data block bound to only the object that you have it assigned to. So if you need a bunch of copies of the same material that do slightly different things, I would create the same material, assign it to everything that you want, and then make them all single user and make each modification as needed. Then I went and started cutting this apart using UV seams. One of the tricks to thinking about UVing that I learned really early on in my career is to think about it like creating a fabric pattern in reverse. Basically, taking a three-dimensional object and cutting it along lines so that you can unfold it without ripping or stretching the imaginary fabric. That really helped the process click for me. Then I modified my existing materials to be somewhat metallic, and I basically just took this base metal that I had assigned to the body of the compass and used it as a base to create tinted versions for each of the main parts of the object, because I thought, hey, it would be kind of cool to have this whole thing be made out of metal like it's a real compass. For the compass face, I used a similar but slightly different material than I had for the compass body, and I paid extra close attention to matching the color blue in my reference, and I did come back to this later, but I wasn't totally happy with it. And I also reduced the amount of bump down to almost zero because the face in the reference is relatively smooth, and the default bump on this metal was just absolutely crazy. Didn't take it away completely because I still wanted those little imperfections, but I did reduce it. Then I added a gradient texture and started testing it. And the goal here was to create a basis so that I could blend between two different shades of blue and give the sort of subtle gradient that the reference compass has. But in order to accomplish that, I first had to position my gradient texture. So I plugged in a texture coordinate to a mapping node and connected that to the vector input on the gradient. And then I worked on centering the gradient. Pro tip, you can also always add a value node and plug that into your scale if you want to change all three scale inputs at the same time without having to set each of them individually. With my gradient positioned, I added a camera and set it to orthographic view because I realized when I set this scene up, I hadn't done that. And then I went back to working on my material. With my gradient set up correctly, I went ahead and plugged a color ramp into the color output of my gradient, and that will just allow me to set what the gradient looks like using the stops on the color ramp. One other cool trick is if you want to see what the texture you're creating or modifying looks like shadeless, you can always take that color output and plug it directly into the material output, and you'll get a shadeless version of whatever the texture looks like at that point in the node tree. With that all set up, I went ahead and plugged it right back into the material and plugged the material back into the material output, and then I disabled scene lighting and world. And by doing that, I was able to set a temporary HDRI to light the scene. And this is a trick I use all the time when I'm still working on my materials and I haven't finalized my world lighting yet. It's a nice way to preview your materials in lots of different lighting conditions without having to go through actually setting up HDRIs. Blender comes with a bunch of pre-canned HDRIs, and you can even modify your default Blender scene to have additional ones if you find ones you like that aren't included with Blender. Then, with my material settings tweaked and finished, I went ahead and started actually lighting the scene. And I use the HDRI library from Polyhaven. The HDRIs themselves are free. Polyhaven has an add-on that they provide that you can pay for that will let you download all of their stuff. Highly recommend it, totally worth it. And actually, if you want to see a bunch of the add-ons that I use in my day-to-day work, I put a bunch of the top ones that I use all the time in a set of links in the description. Disclaimer, those are referral links, which means if you buy the add-ons through them, you won't be charged extra, but you will give me money with each purchase, which helps support the channel. Then I moved on to animating the compass, and first I set keys to tip the compass backwards, and then I inserted a single movement key into the needle position, and I decided I was going to do this mostly using F-curve modifiers rather than keying each movement of the needle. When I'm animating, I always take the approach of trying to do the absolute minimal amount of keying possible and doing as much as I can both through F-curve modification, F-curve modifiers, and just very careful tweaking of curves. And that's something that I had basically drilled into me by one of the first animation professors I ever had way back in college, back around 2015 or so. So the modifier I added to this F-curve is the noise modifier. And basically that generates random noise, and if you specify a frame range, you can restrict that noise to that range, which is what I was doing there. And basically I set it up to generate a little bit of random movement noise on the Y rotation axis, which is the axis that the needle is set up to spin around. And then I also set up a blend in and blend out value, which is basically just how many frames of transition you want between your first key and your last key, or the first position that you've restricted and the last position you've restricted, which in this case is frames 30 to frame 300. And I've laid in about 30 frames of blending, which means 30 frames in front of and behind our animated area are being used to blend that animation from start to finish, which just helps smooth the transition between the noisy area and the dead stillness. And I think I've hammered this enough in my other videos, but it bears repeating. Animation is a game that is defined by enormous amounts of time put into very small amounts of actual playback. I make these videos about 15 to 25 minutes long, but in reality, the amount of work I'm doing on animating stuff eats up several hours. And that's for something very simple. So if you're just starting out and you haven't practiced animation much, don't get discouraged if it takes you a really, really long time to do stuff. It gets faster, but even when you are at the absolute peak of your career, like DreamWorks animators, it still takes them ages to do stuff. Now, they're definitely better, and they have a much better eye for this kind of stuff, but it still takes ages to finish a product no matter what you're doing. And a lot of that time will be spent just in the F-curves, tweaking things until movement is just really natural and it looks really good. And then I just ended the animation by keying the compass so that it tips back after the noise portion ends. And I also used back interpolation on this, which basically causes the animation to go slightly past the point that it's been keyed to and then return to that key. And that just adds a little bit of sort of natural looking motion that I thought added a little bit of realism. And here's what that one looks like on the dock. In contrast to Safari, the app we all probably use semi-frequently, I picked another app that we all kind of hope we don't have to use ever, Time Machine. Time Machine is admittedly very cool in that you can use it to basically recover all of your stuff after you've massively screwed something up, but I don't think any of us are hoping to massively screw something up badly enough to actually have to use it. And this one I kind of ideated on the fly, which you'll see. I ended up abandoning this idea of a sort of glass sphere that I started with, which you can see me making right here, and I went with something else instead. But I'm going to use the portion where I'm making the glass sphere to talk about something else, which is reusing models. You can see here that I am reusing the app body that I made for the Safari compass. Now, there's no reason for me to go back and make that again, and I highly encourage you to set up an asset library of your own work if you don't have one already. But what I wanted to talk about goes beyond that. One of the common misconceptions I see all the time from people entering the 3D space as brand new artists is that you absolutely shouldn't use pre-made assets in any capacity. This could not be further from the truth. There's nothing wrong with using pre-made assets as long as you respect all various IPs associated with those assets and you're honest about what stuff in your portfolio includes pre-made assets and in what capacity you did the work creating the models themselves. And if you're doing environment work, a lot of it is going to be pre-made assets because making all the vegetation and stuff would take an eternity for one person. And I really don't want people to get bottlenecked by this stuff because when you move to doing small commercial work, like your first freelance gigs, leaning on that type of asset for image deliverables is crucial. If you're trying to make every single thing you do from scratch, you will never outcompete other freelancers who are delivering a higher quality product because they used pre-made assets and instead spent that time polishing and making their animation or deliverable perfect. Anyway, rant/business tip over. With my idea of a glass sphere abandoned, I went ahead and started making this arrow by just adding a circle, extruding it inward, and then modifying the end of it to be this sort of rounded arrow shape. And you can see I didn't do this perfectly the first time around. In fact, it took me a handful of tries. And then I finished it, realized it wasn't the right size, so I did a bunch of scaling on it, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, I'm trying to leave stuff into this video so that you can see that even my process as an artist who's been working for a decade isn't perfect. I go back on stuff all the time, repolish things, change things. Nobody's perfect, so don't put that pressure on yourself to be perfect every single time you do work, but do put the pressure on yourself to learn from your mistakes every time you make them and try and get a little bit better every time. By the way, if you're trying to bevel individual vertices like I was doing here, the hotkey for that is Control-Shift-B. That's something I use all the time. With my arrow shape made, I went ahead and extruded it outward, and then I just added an inset and beveled the edges to add some support and give it a little bit more of a dynamic look. Then I lined my icon up so that I could make the clock thing, and I'm not going for a perfect representation here, but I'm going to be close. And so I went ahead and started making the hands, and those I just made out of simple planes that I extruded and beveled the ends of to round them. One other tip that you're going to see me do here is with an object rotated but the rotation not applied, you can move your vertices along the object's local axis by hitting G and then the axis key on your keyboard twice. So in that case, I was doing Y. So by hitting G, Y, Y, I'm able to move the object's vertices along the Y-axis of the object locally rather than globally, which allows me to slide them in and out like that without having to put the object's rotation back to 0 in my world space. Now I'm going to make a really cool controllable gradient texture, and we're going to have that gradient texture be controlled by an object. And to do that, I'm just going to run a gradient texture right through a color ramp so that I have a little bit more control over it, add a mapping node, and add a texture coordinate node. And then I'm going to connect the object output of the texture coordinate node to the mapping node and select in the object slot the empty sphere that I have added as my controller. Then I'm going to use the same value trick to control the size of the texture and just scale it up to something reasonable. And now you can see when I move this object around, I can control the position of my gradient. And I can even control it by scaling the object up and down, moving the object closer or further, rotating it around, you name it. It's a super cool way to add some dynamic animation to your textures and control it by just animating objects rather than having to muck around in the node group animating the nodes themselves. And I just used colors on that color ramp to create the same types of colors that you can see in my reference, and I actually just pulled them directly using the eyedropper to sample each of the colors, the light and the dark. And I had this idea of having this sort of gradient that's in the original logo spin along with the arrow and the clock winding backwards. And so to do that, I parented my controller or the gradient texture right to the arrow itself. So when I rotate the arrow, the gradient texture will come along with it. Next, I needed to find out a way to animate the clock, and for that, I decided I was going to use drivers. Drivers are an incredibly powerful tool that is built into Blender that basically allows you to set one value using a mathematical expression hooked onto another value. To create the driver for this, I basically just copied the transform that I want to use to drive the driver, and you can right click and say copy as driver, and then I pasted it into the same rotation transform for the smaller hand of the clock. And basically the way I want this to work is when I rotate the larger hand, I want the smaller hand to rotate a fraction of the amount that the larger hand is rotating. So to do that, I changed the expression type to scripted expression and changed the scripted expression to be the rotation of the larger hand divided by 3. And basically what that means is the rotation of the smaller hand will be the numerical value of the rotation of the larger hand divided by 3. And so for every rotation of the large hand, the small hand will make 1/3 of that. Then I started keying the arrow's rotation, and basically the goal is for the arrow to start slow and the clock to start slow, and for them to get faster and faster and faster, and that background to get brighter and brighter until a time warp effect that I'm going to create in a little bit kicks in a later section. To accomplish this, I basically just keyed the in and out points for the clock and the arrow, and I spent a bunch of time fiddling with the F curves until I was happy with the progression from slow to fast. Then I did the same thing for the emission value of the background shader so that it would slowly get brighter and brighter as the clock and arrow got faster and faster. It was pretty simple, but it was just a lot of fiddling around in the F curves, just like I mentioned before. And then I decided to add a smoke simulation and a particle simulation to create the vortex of the time warp. And the idea would be there would be this vortex that pops in as that light and speed gets faster and faster, and it would show the Apple logo going backwards from its current iteration all the way to the beginning, the very first Apple logo they ever made back in the 90s or 80s, and basically just show the history of the logo going backwards really, really fast, maybe repeating a few times to indicate what Time Machine does. And I tried over and over and over again to get this smoke simulation to look how I wanted, and I just ultimately could not get an effect that I was happy with. And so after probably 7 or 8 hours of fiddling with this thing, I scrapped it and I went back to the drawing board to do a purely particle simulation. For this, I created a simple simulation, but with a lot more particles than I'd been previously using. And to get that sort of moving inward, but not totally occluding the entire circle effect, I shortened the lifetime of the particles so they would die out before they reached dead center. To add the spinning effect, I added a vortex force field and a wind force field just to push the particles up slightly as they were spinning. Then I baked the simulation and took a look at my results. With the simulation baked, I moved back out of my scene that I'd been using to simulate and into my main scene, and I created a collection instance of the simulation because I had it in a collection, and I animated some rotation onto that collection. And that effect is just going to help heighten the amount of motion blur on the particles to beyond what I would get from just the particle's motion itself. When I was happy with how the simulation looked, I moved on to working on the materials. And for the materials, I just used a simple emission material, and I copied the cool part of my gradient setup that I'd used on the background and used that to control a color ramp between a blue and green texture to give it this kind of cool fading blue and green look that would swirl as the particles swirled. Finally, to make the transition between the particle system and the solid background, I just keyed the objects themselves in the outliner, very simply just setting the visibility from off to on, render visibility from off to on, one frame to the next. Nothing super complicated, but honestly, I've always found that the simplest tricks are often the most effective. And here's what the final result looks like. And that about wraps it up for this one. So I guess that means it's my time to remind you to ring the bell, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, join the Discord, and remember, never stop learning.